Good afternoon. I'm Thomas Shaw, and welcome to the 12th day of our Lenten series, the Catechism of the Orthodox Faith according to the Old Testament. Now, we Orthodox Christians have a lot of holy days, and today is one in particular. It's the Annunciation of our Lord to the Virgin Mary by the angel Gabriel. It's also a national holiday among those who are of Greek descent or celebrate or are Christians in Greek churches. So Kali Eleftheria Solus, and blessed and joyous feast day to all. Today, I want to talk a little bit about calendars and holidays in the Old Testament. Now, there are four kinds of calendars. There are lunar calendars, solar calendars, stellar calendars, and state calendars. Now, lunar calendars are simple. They start when the new moon is sighted in the west at sundown, and then continue through the phases of the moon, completing with the dark period, the dark moon, what we call the new moon as well, and then begin again. These months are on average 29 and a half days long, so lunar months are generally 29 to 30 days long. Now, a lunar year is 354 days if you count 12 lunar months. The solar year is one we're very familiar with. That counts the movement of the sun against the seasons, against the equinoxes and solstices. And the length of such a year is 365 and a quarter days. Now, a stellar year might seem very similar to a solar year, but it isn't exactly, because the equinoxes do something called a precession. Precession means that the equinoxes, which are the days in the spring and the fall, we just have one, so they might be fresh in your mind. When the equinoxes and the rest of the solar calendar slowly shift against the background of stars. This is the reason for such things as the so-called Platonic year, where the zodiacal signs move against the equinoxes. And it's such an impending change, the change from Pisces, where the equinox is now, to Aquarius. You see, they move backwards against the sign, since Aquarius occurs before Pisces. Then we get the age of Aquarius, when the spring equinox will be in the sign Aquarius. Some people think that's happened, it's going to happen. All depends on how you compute these things. But these are of no relevance, of course, to us as Orthodox Christians. Although it is interesting to note that at the time of Christ, there was a transition underway, a similar transition from what would be called the age of Aries to the age of Pisces. And we do find a lot of fish symbolism associated with early Christianity in the Gospels. But whether this is associated with this shift or not is unknown, and there could be many other reasons for such symbolism. So the stellar year is also around 365 days long, but not exactly the same as the solar year. Now, a state year is a formalized year used by a state, and almost all calendars that are actually being employed or put in force by some authority, and thus things can become somewhat conventionalized, and we see this on our own calendar, where the month And our state calendar no longer is a lunar month, and it doesn't even have a relationship to solar months. If one were to start a solar month on the equinox and then divide the year into 12 equal parts of 30 days plus a few months with 31 to get to 365 or 366 days, to have leap years and so forth, to keep the calendar on track with the equinox. If then our calendar, we would just be beginning a new month right now, but we don't. Instead, the equinoxes occur around somewhere between the 20th to the 22nd of the month, depending on the year. So this is our modern calendar is a state calendar. And we're dealing with the state of Israel and the state of Judah and the holidays. So in some ways, these calendars are also state calendars and may have some conventional aspects and not be purely based on these factors. Now there's a combination calendar called a lunar solar calendar. And it's this kind of calendar that we find being used for Passover. So Passover was the day upon which its origin was in Egypt when the Israelites were fleeing and the angel of death flew over. In order for the angel of death to know which houses not to kill the eldest male child, the lintels of the doorways were marked with the sign of the cross, with the like this, the old Hebrew T, and with the blood of a lamb that was sacrificed for this purpose. And this event was commemorated on the first full moon following the vernal equinox. And this is still the conventional way that it is done among Jews today, although sometimes there's an intervening full moon because of the way that these things are calculated in a state calendar fashion. An example where a state calendar, in this case, it's not a state, but the conventions of rabbis over the centuries have made it so that in order to tell when is this Passover going to be next year, 10 years from now, and so forth, you have to anticipate when the full moon is going to occur. And this requires certain kinds of calculations. And these calculations change over time and became a more, let's say, exact. For instance, today in the Orthodox Church, our Passover, according to our Pascha, which is the Sunday after Passover, is the Sunday after the full moon, after the vernal equinox. But because this is a state calendar, in this case, one of canon law, the equinox is off by 13 days and the full moon is off by several days according to the way it's calculated in our books, because our books have gone out of sync over the centuries since they were set up with astronomy, and we still follow. And of course, we know about the calendar conflict that's gone on for a century now in the church, which attempted to bring our canon law state calendar more into line with a true lunar solar calendar. But these efforts, for various political reasons, haven't succeeded. So we have disjunction among the Orthodox as to when we celebrate various holidays, but not Pascha and the period leading up to it or the period after it, because these are all associated with this spring cycle of holidays in the Bible. So Passover in the time of the temple, in the time of Hezekiah and later Josiah, where it becomes increasingly prominent, and the centralization was taking place of all religious practices into the temple, and various kinds of temples, other cultic places were abolished and not given legitimacy anymore. Then all Israelites would assemble into Jerusalem on Passover to take their Passover lambs to the temple to be ritually sacrificed by the priests. So this would happen on Passover. And Passover, the days, and we have to remember in the Old Testament and still in our church canon law, conventional state calendar, our day begins with sundown. So Passover would begin with sundown, and that was the time when you began to eliminate all leaven from the house. You either ate it or you burned it or somehow you got rid of it all by the next morning. And then there was a certain time when it was declared that all leaven had been eliminated. And at that time, they began the process of people taking their lambs to the temple to be sacrificed. And it was during this period the Gospel of John informs us that the crucifixion took place, while the lambs are being slaughtered in the temple, while they are being sacrificed. So that's the first day, and that's Passover. Now, the next day, which actually happens only a few hours later, because the day begins again with sundown, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So at this feast, no leaven would be consumed. The bread would have to be unleavened, and we know that over time that a seder meal has been established among Jews today, which has an entire liturgy done in the home, where they review the various foods that are put on the table and what their significance is, and teach children to understand how Passover is related to the Exodus. So this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It goes on for 7 days. So for 7 days, no leaven can be consumed. And then on the following the Feast of Unleavened Bread comes the Feast of First Fruits of Barley. Now, there's some disagreement as to the relationship between these 2 days. In Rabbinic Judaism, it happens on the following day, so there's day 1, 2, and 3. But among the Samaritans and among other fringe, more, I don't want to use the term fringe, but not central to the rabbinic tradition, first fruits was on the Sunday following the Passover, because this avoided it occurring on the Sabbath. So the resurrection of our Lord then happens on this particular day, the first fruits. And we notice that the Apostle Paul mentions a connection between the idea of first fruits, also called the holiday of the sheaf, because you would go to the temple with a sheaf of barley. And it's on first fruits that you begin counting. So you count from the first fruits is day 1, and on day 50 you have Pentecost. So if first fruits is on Sunday, Pentecost is also on Sunday. And we Christians, not only because the Lord was resurrected on that day, or perhaps he was resurrected on that day because it was first fruits, follow this alternative tradition where first fruits, the sheaf, now the resurrection is on Sunday, and the Pentecost is on Sunday. So on Pentecost celebrated also the first fruits, but not the first fruits of the barley harvest, but the first fruits of the wheat harvest. And bread was prepared, and leavened bread was prepared. And so leavened bread was offered in a wave offering. We'll get into some more details, perhaps, into the kinds of offerings and sacrifices that would go on. And then the bread and wine and the sacrificed animals would be eaten by the priests with the king of Judah. And the king and the priests would recline, because in those days, remember, people didn't sit at tables and chairs to eat, but they reclined to eat, would recline in the presence of the king, which was considered to be very improper, except for this one day, when in a sense, the Pentecost elevated them spiritually to equality, so that the entire representation of the future church would eat leavened bread and wine and in the presence of the king. And we can see the obvious connections and symbolism that flow into the Christian Eucharist. And of course, it's on Pentecost that the apostles received the gift of the Holy Spirit. Now, in the fall, there was a different set of holidays, and they were trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. Now, trumpets kicks off this holiday season. It's best known for the use of the ram's horn, the shofar, a kind of trumpet that everybody goes out, even today in Israel, on this day, and everybody blows their trumpet to announce the beginning of this festival season. And then on the 10th day, so this is the first day of the 7th month. This is normally counted in the 7th month after the first month, which is when Passover took place. So trumpets is on the first day, atonement on the 10th day, and tabernacles last for 14 days starting on the 14th day. So atonement, which we hear a lot of because we talk a lot about the atonement of Jesus Christ, the atonement was a yearly festival that in which the sins of the previous year were confessed and forgiven. The lamb was renewed, everything was renewed, and in preparation for the coming rainy season, and the planting of the wheat and so forth, the beginning of the agricultural cycle that winds up over here. Now, the atonement was a complicated ritual in which, besides the other animals being sacrificed, there were 2 goats involved. The high priest would decide by lot which of these goats was for Yahweh, for the divine name, for the Lord, and which one was for Azazel, which was an ancient name of the head of the demons. So the scapegoat, as it's often called, the goat for Azazel, was driven out into the wilderness with a scarlet thread around its neck, indicating the sins, and it would be pushed over a cliff, and then out in the Judean desert, and then through a series of signs from high places, the people in Jerusalem would be informed this had happened, and then the other goat would be sacrificed. And according to Margaret Barker, there's evidence that this was the only time in which blood was consumed at all during any ritual, and we'll get into blood symbolism another time, and that the high priest would actually eat of the raw flesh and blood of the goat, And then that blood would be put into a bowl, and the high priest would take that blood into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle around and then come on out. And this, various other things would go on, but this was the heart of the event, of the atonement, which would forgive sins for the year, both known and unknown sin. So every kind of sin that had happened would be forgiven that happened during the course of the year. Finally, on tabernacles, the people would construct, and still do, construct a sukkot, a kind of a tent type thing, or some other kind of structure outside to go live in for a week. And there are various processions that go on. There are certain plants that are used of the season, and particularly the palm is used because when we find Christ entering into Jerusalem, we find Sukkot out of season. That a procession like that of the king, once the enthroned king, and then today the Torah is taken in procession, the Torah scroll is taken procession. One time is the enthroned king in procession, and the palms and other things, the citron and willow branches, other myrtle branches, and so forth, would be held. And this was a procession that this is being alluded to by the entry of Jesus on Palm Sunday. And this is why Jesus curses the fig tree, because the figs come into season in the fall, and figs are associated with the time of tabernacles. And he cursed the fig tree because the fig tree isn't in sync, because all these things, instead of happening on this cycle, are happening on this cycle. There was also a controversial between the rabbis and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, part of this festival of tabernacles, that had to do with water. And this is the occasion for Jesus saying, out of me will come living water. He's at the Feast of Tabernacles. In the Gospel of John, there's reference made to, I think, all of these festivals in some way or another, and also to Hanukkah, which I haven't put on the list. But just to close out, Hanukkah is the late second temple festival. It's actually a Judean state national festival. It has to do with the time of the Maccabees, when there was insufficient oil for the lamp in the temple, and yet it burned for an entire week, so 8 days. And so the candlestick used for Hanukkah has eight candles, rather than the one in the temple that had 7. This was a brief review we did of the festivals of the period. We'll get a little bit more into calendars later when we talk about the relationship between the fall, potential relationship between the fall sequence and atonement and the stellar calendar. But we'll leave that for another time. Hope you have a blessed Lent, that you're well into it now, and that this was a great day for you, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow.